Our new book is called The School for Whatnots by Margaret Peterson Haddix. Chapter 1, 11 years ago. When Maximilian J. Sterling was born, his family celebrated by throwing a party for the whole city, complete with the biggest fireworks display anyone had ever seen. Though his parents showed off the baby throughout the day from the terrace of their mansion, by nightfall they'd retreated indoors. The night air brought mosquitoes and unhealthy fogs, and everybody understood that newborn Maximilian must, of course, be kept safe from threats. But his mother held him up to the terrace windows as the dark sky exploded into bright lights above him, and below, every person from the entire city seemed to be crowded onto the mansion grounds to ooh and ah and cheer. "Look, little man," Mrs. Sterling murmured to her swaddled baby. "Everyone is so happy that you're here, so delighted to rejoice with us. You will always be surrounded by love." Behind her, the night nurse snorted. Up until that moment, Maximilian's mother had viewed the night nurse as a great ally and friend. Mrs. Sterling had learned that the night nurse's name was Beverly, and her favorite flavor of chocolate was dark with orange peels. But now, Mrs. Sterling felt a slight nagging fear that Nurse Beverly was gifted at more than bottle prep and the proper positioning of a baby in need of a good solid burp. What if she was one of those evil fairy godmothers in a fairy tale about to foretell a baby's doom? Mrs. Sterling wrapped her arms tighter around the bundle of soft blankets that surrounded baby Maximilian. She might have looked dainty and decorative, but she was a stalwart woman with a strong grip. "Why does that make sense? Why do you make that noise?" Mrs. Sterling asked Nurse Beverly. Do you disagree?" Nurse Beverly gulped. She did not want to be fired. She had not intended to be heard. She was more accustomed to talking with babies than anyone else, and sometimes she forgot that humans over the age of 1 tended to expect more give and take in their conversations. "Please," Mrs. Sterling pleaded, "be honest. I need to know if there's ever going to be someone around my son who's not loving and kind. I need to know so I can protect him." Nurse Beverly had the unpleasant sensation that she was about to let out a belch. This was one of the reasons she enjoyed being around babies more than anything else. Babies didn't care about manners. Nurse Beverly liked it when parents she worked for went to bed, and she could settle in with the tiny sleepless babies and whisper all night long into their ears, You are wonderful just the way you are. You are a miracle even now, even before you become something else, even before you grow a minute older. Don't tell anyone, and don't let anyone tell you different. You be you. I'll be me. We'll get along great." She also liked to tell them the plots of her favorite mystery stories. But with the belch coming on, Nurse Beverly rushed to answer Mrs. Sterling before she had time to think. Nurse Beverly had a tendency to do that. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Nurse Beverly said, "but this baby is the son of a billionaire. I'm guessing he became a millionaire just by being born. Of course, he'll have some people around him who love him just for him. You, of course, your husband, probably at least 1 or 2 of his friends, but he'll also be surrounded by people who just want invitations to the best birthday party in town. People who want to water ski on your family's lake, or fly on your family's private jet. People who want to ride in the Porsche he gets for his 16th birthday." Nurse Beverly wondered if she'd gone too far, mentioning the private lake and the jet and the Porsche. Was she not supposed to know that the Sterlings owned a lake bigger than most countries? Small countries, of course, but still. Was she not supposed to know that Mrs. Sterling's husband collected custom cars and antique planes and had hundreds of them stashed in garages and hangars all over the city? Or that one of their family companies held mining rights to the moon, which probably made them trillionaires, not just billionaires? Those weren't the facts she tried to learn. They were just things everybody knew. You fear that my son will be surrounded more by greed than by love, Mrs. Sterling said, jutting her jaw defensively skyward. And that he will never learn to tell the difference? Behind her, the sky exploded with red and yellow and green lights, and a boom shook the windows a second later. But Mrs. Sterling seemed to have forgotten the fireworks. You're saying that my son will grow up to be a spoiled brat? Mrs. Sterling continued. You believe he will never know the difference between the beauty of his own soul and the appeal of all his money? Um, er, Nurse Beverly said, flustered. She forgot she'd been about to belch. It surprised right out of her. Usually only babies seemed to understand her. But here was this woman who could still look beautiful mere hours after giving birth, who wore a silk robe that probably cost more than Nurse Beverly had earned in her entire life. And she seemed to be plucking thoughts straight from Nurse Beverly's brain and then speaking them with fancier words. Mrs. Sterling gazed down at her son's tiny face. He puckered his lips at her, which might have been his first ever attempt at a kiss. My son will not grow up to be spoiled, Mrs. Sterling pronounced, as grandly as if she were the one in a fairy tale who forgot to foretell the future. He will not be surrounded by greedy people. He'll always know that his own soul is more valuable than money. Okay, Nurse Beverly said, because she'd learned at the very, very beginning of her career that it was unwise to make enemies of the women she worked for. Nurse Beverly generally did not think about what had happened to the babies she tended past the advent of their first birthday. But Mrs. Sterling was making her curious about Maximilian's future. It wasn't wise to linger on this dangerous topic. But Nurse Beverly had another question anyway. How do you think you're going to accomplish that? I know how, Mrs. Sterling said. She lifted her chin so high in the air now, it seemed to be pointing straight to the sky. Maximilian will not grow up around other children at all. He'll have whatnots. Chapter 2, The Narrator's Aside. You know what whatnots are, right? No? I guess they're mostly whispered about. Unless you're in certain circles, you'll probably think they're only rumors. But of course they're real. And of course, like most things discussed only in whispers, there are dozens of ways of explaining them. Some say it was the first rich parents who ordered the first set of whatnots, and they remembered only two things from childhood: that kids can be mean, and that sticks, stones, and words can still hurt you. It's a little up in the air about whether those parents meant to protect their kids' friends, or their own reputations. Because what if their own kid turned out to be a bully? It's always been a little up in the air as to whether the inventor of the whatnots, Frances Miranda Gonzaga, wanted to help the rich people or just become rich herself. But rich people ordered whatnots in droves, more than the mansions, more than the humongous bank accounts, more than the private self-piloting helicopters. Whatnots became the symbol of those who were wealthy and those who weren't. Anybody had whatnots for their kids. Soon the children had whatnots in school, on their sports teams, in all their extracurriculars like plays and musicals, where the rich kid was always the star, of course. You get the idea. And the name? Whatnots? Of course, that's just a fancy rich person name for something somebody else would describe with ordinary words. You know, like caviar is really fish eggs. Take away the mysterious name, look past the elegant packaging, ignore the status symbol maneuvering, and it's clear. Whatnots are just robots. Robots that look and act So much like humans that no one can tell the difference. Androids, machines. And now, don't you feel a little sorry for all the rich kids who have nothing but machines for friends? And they don't even know it. Chapter 3. 6 years ago, Maximilian's first day of kindergarten, the beginning. I like jumping in mud puddles, do you? Maximilian peered at the small person who had plopped down on the plush carpet next to his, just as class was about to start. The teacher was still standing in the doorway, greeting the last arrivals. All the other children in the circle were sitting quietly and tidily, their hands folded in their laps, their legs tucked crisscross applesauce, but not this girl? Maximilian guessed she was a girl, though it didn't matter to him one way or the other. She stood out, not just because she was talking, but also because she had what looked like dried finger paint not quite scrubbed off from her wrists. It couldn't possibly be dirt, could it? Her dark hair stood up in two tufts of circled haphazardly with ponytail rubber bands on opposite sides of her head. She bounced up and down, her eyes positively dancing. Because of mud puddles? Maximilian wondered. Wasn't that just rain that didn't go anywhere and it got dirty sitting on the ground? I don't know if I'd like to jump in mud puddles or not, Maximilian said politely. I never tried. Oh no, the girl said, as if Maximilian was admitting to never having eaten cake or never having petted a dog. She patted his back, as if he were sad or sick or desperately in need, like the poor people Maximilian had seen lined up along the street once when the limo driver took the wrong turn. The old limo driver, before he got fired. Well, I heard school has this thing called recess, where we go outside and do whatever we want. I'll show you about jumping in puddles then. Okay, Maximilian said. He waited, trying so hard not to squirm. His teachers in preschool had always told him he had a problem with that. He couldn't understand how other kids could sit so still, like statues. Maximilian couldn't even play flying statues or freeze tag without squirming. At least Bouncy Girl wasn't sitting still either. What's your name? Bouncy Girl asked. Maximilian flattened the folds of his new shirt and pointed to the neatly written name tag the teacher had put on his chest when he arrived at school. Maximilian. He sounded out the name to her, sounding each syllable in turn. Oh no, the girl said, again, just as distressed as before. What? Max said, peering around in case a band of marauding monkeys had just entered the room, or storybook parents or fairy tale witches. Those were the worst disasters Maximilian could imagine. But Bouncy Girl was only gazing at Maximilian's name tag. Your name has so many letters, she said. Don't you know we'll have to write our names again and again and again in school? Quick, let's make it shorter. She ran over and grabbed a fat green marker from the nearest table and came back to scribble out most of the letters on Maximilian's name tag. Leave the X, Maximilian said anxiously. That's my favorite. Okay, the girl said. I like the S best in my name because she made a jerky motion with her head, like it was a snake slithering side to side. It shimmies. What is your name? Max asked, because he couldn't make any sense of the jumble of letters on her name tag. I'm Josie, the girl said. She put her marker down. And now you're Max. Don't forget. 3 letters, not 11. Not 10. Max, Max repeated. He was enchanted by the girl's shimmying head and his own easier name and the promise of mud puddles. Maybe he was like a child in a fairy tale, falling under a magical creature's spell, because it didn't even occur to him to wonder how she was already so good at reading and counting, or how she was already in charge. Chapter 4. Still the first day of kindergarten, the end of the first day. Young Maximilian! The chauffeur thundered as soon as Max stepped out of the school doors and tripped toward the limo waiting at the front curb. It's just Max now, Max said. The chauffeur sniffed. He glared long enough for Max to wonder why the chauffeur had been yelling. Oh, it is? Max said, trying to imitate his father's way of talking to the servants. The chauffeur stopped standing so erectly beside the limo. He circled around to the truck and pulled out stacks of blankets. I shall have to protect the seats and the floor from every inch of you, he fumed. He opened the back door of the limo and began spreading blankets everywhere. Max looked down at himself. His new white pure cotton shirt was polka dotted with mud now. His stiff blue shorts were striped with tarry black spots. And his legs, they were the best. Max had not known it was possible for mud to completely coat someone's skin. It looked like he was wearing two thick brown casts, only the mud was drying now. While Max watched, one huge clump fell off, keeping the perfect curve of his leg. The molded mud hit the sidewalk and crumbled. Max would have happily watched that again and again. It was like seeing glaciers calving or moths bursting out of their cocoon. Max poked at the cast on the other leg, and it came off in flakes. That was fun, too. You little... The chauffeur clapped his hand over his own mouth. Now the only words that came out were a muffled... Max smiled politely as he'd been taught. Thank you for taking me home, Mr. Chauffeur, he said, sliding into the pile of blankets. They were hot and itchy, and Max began to wonder at the way the drying mud on his legs pinched his skin together. And why was the chauffeur so grumpy? Max was not used to people being mean. Fortunately, it was a short drive from the school to his family's mansion, but the chauffeur didn't pull up at the large roundabout directly in front of Max's house. Instead, he took the turnoff that led to the servants' quarters behind the pool house. Mr. Chauffeur, Max began. Where? But the chauffeur had already stopped at the car and jumped out, slamming the door behind him. Max waited for the chauffeur to circle the car and get the little stool out of the trunk to make it easier for Max to step down out into the pavement. Then Max could ask what was wrong. Only the chauffeur didn't head for the trunk. He ran into the servants' quarters. He let that door slam too. Max was not used to people slamming doors around him. For a moment, Max just waited, but a single moment can feel like an eternity to a 5-year-old, especially one who's bursting to tell his mother about his first day of kindergarten, and he just learned to jump in mud puddles and made a little model of himself on a 3D printer and raced Lego cars. He'd won, and he reached for the door handle. It was locked. Max was not surprised. He knew there were always locks on everything unsafe around him, but the chauffeur's door wouldn't be locked? Did he dare? Max really did try to wait longer, but the seatbelt of his specially designed car seat cut into his legs when he bounced them up and down, and the blankets bunched a little bit more with every bounce, and he'd already had to sit still for too much of the day. He quickly unfastened the seatbelt and dived for the front seat and out the chauffeur's door. Freedom! Should he walk just up to his own house, high atop his own hill? The curving driveway looked so long. He'd heard his father say to his mother, sometimes you have to remind the servants they work for you, and it doesn't matter what they want. They're getting paid to follow your orders. Max walked down the short concrete path toward the servants' quarters. Their front door was plain and unadored, and that intrigued Max enough that he didn't knock right away. The heavy smell of cooking food hovered in the air. Something with onions, maybe? Max loved onions. Didn't they know it was rude not to share? Then Max saw that a window was open, and he heard the chauffeur's voice. Not fair, he was saying. The boss yells at me if there's a piece of lint left behind his seat, and now I'm supposed to deal with that? This filth? Sotheby, a calm, soothing voice replied. Don't you remember being a kid? Don't you remember playing in mud? It was Nurse Beverly. For years, she'd gone from one newborn baby's house to another, but somehow with Max's family, she just stayed and stayed. He didn't remember it, of course, but when he turned 3 months old, and then 6 months, and then a year, Nurse Beverly had said to his mother, you know, I'll have to give the employment agency some warning for them to find me another job. And each time Max's mother had said, "Let's not think about that yet." And now there was no talk of Nurse Beverly leaving. She was no longer needed to burp and change Max, and so far he'd had no younger brothers or sisters for her to attend. But everything in the household seemed to run more smoothly when Nurse Beverly was around. Now, Max's knees went weak with relief, and he slid down out of the sight of his open window, his back pressed comfortingly against the wall. The corners of his mouth tugged up into a grin. Just hearing Nurse Beverly's voice made him feel like he'd been enfolded into her pillowy white arms and cuddled onto her soft lap. Nurse Beverly would make everything right with the chauffeur. "You think I was some filthy little kid playing in the gutter?" the chauffeur asked indignantly. "I know you weren't born with the name Sotheby," Nurse Beverly replied. Max could hear the grin in her voice, and the affection, which always went along with the twinkle in her eye. She was talking to the chauffeur the same way she talked to Max. "Don't tell anyone," the chauffeur said, and now he sounded like he was grinning too. "And oh yeah, the kid changed his name today too. He informed me he's Max now, not Maximilian." That fascinated Max. Did he and the chauffeur actually have something in common? Did everyone get a chance to shed old identities as they grew up? Who had the chauffeur been before he became Sotheby? And that bit about the chauffeur not wanting Nurse Beverly to tell? Did adults keep secrets? "Look, I'll deal with Max," Nurse Beverly told the chauffeur, "and the mud. I don't mind vacuuming for you, and yes, I realize you just scammed me into doing your job. But isn't it worth it to let a kid be a kid?" The chauffeur's reply was barely more than a grunt. Max realized that he needed to scramble back into the car because the chauffeur was going to come back. But as Max stood up, careful to keep his back hunched over so he couldn't be seen through the window, he heard Nurse Beverly say one more thing. "I guess those whatnots will be good for him after all." Whatnots? Max thought, dashing back toward the car. He'd never heard that word before. The way Nurse Beverly said it made it stick in his mind and set off a war in his body. As much as he wanted to get back to the car before the chauffeur caught him eavesdropping, Max also wanted to pop up and balance on his chin on the window ledge and boldly ask, "What are whatnots?" Somehow, even though he just met Josie, he knew that was exactly the kind of thing she would have done. But Max was running toward the car, and somehow in the hubbub of getting back into his car seat and arriving back at his house and having everyone exclaim over his first day of school, he never quite managed to ask. Maybe the day had already been too strange and new. Maybe he was simply afraid. But that word, whatnot, settled into his brain like a platter, like a splinter, like a chip of glass, like everything that looks healed over but truly isn't. And the can still gives pangs years earlier. And so the memory came back to him next time he heard the word, but that wouldn't be for another 6 years. Chapter 5. The narrator's aside. Rewind, you see it, don't you? Look back at Max's first moments in kindergarten again. Just you and me. It's a shame, really. The Whatnot Corporation went to such incredible effort to ensure Max was surrounded by all those perfect little whatnots. But once he met Josie that first morning, Max barely glanced at any other child. So here's the bigger picture. You'll want to look around more than Max did. Of course, the classroom was perfect, so full of light and color that any 5-year-old would quickly learn their first lesson any good kindergarten teacher tries to impart. School's going to be so much fun. Learning is going to be so much fun. You'll love it your whole entire life. Remember? If that wasn't your experience at kindergarten, I'm sorry, really. In Max's kindergarten classroom, a state-of-the-art aquarium gurgled softly in the back corner, the exotic fish cheerfully gliding by. The play area had all the best toys, so Max and Josie and any of the others could try their hands at pretending to be engineers or chefs, astronauts or doctors or archaeologists. Of course, there were security cameras watching everyone in the room. so Max would be kept safe. But the cameras were hidden in the dress up corner's mirror, on the fake apple in the teacher's desk, in the easel set up ready for finger painting, and of course the room was loaded with other technology too, but it was discreetly hidden. The teacher's computer screen and keyboard were embedded in her desk out of sight. The play area, intended to teach computer coding, looked more like a happy but organized jumble of strings and beads. And the whatnots, the pinnacle of technological advancement, looked like perfectly normal children. Look, for example, at the whatnot named Ivy. Such an adorable little girl whose brown eyes glowed as she peered longingly toward the fat boxes of colored pencils and the stacks of multicolored paper, ready for any art project any child might imagine. But Ivy did that only for an instant before snapping back to attention at, at the teacher. Then Ivy sat perfectly still, perfectly erect, her hands folded perfectly in her lap, her head tilted ever so slightly to the left as she listened intently to the teacher's every word. Look at the red-headed, freckled whatnot named Jack, who had a yo-yo in his back pocket, but showed such admirable restraint in not even touching it, never once twisting around to play with the string. Instead, Jack sat perfectly still, perfectly erect, his hands folded perfectly in his lap, his head tilted ever so slightly to the right as he listened intently to the teacher's every word. Oh, never mind. Why bother? I don't need to tell you about the 13 other children who were perfectly groomed, perfectly behaved, perfectly adorable, even in their slight imperfections, like the little boy with the jug handle ears, who seemed not to have grown up into them yet, the little girl with the slight overbite that promised to look cute with braces in the very near future. They were all so beautiful, so lifelike, their features so precise. You would have sworn that every single one of them was real, but they were only whatnots. Of course they were perfect. And then there was Max and Josie. Even when he first walked into the classroom, Max's shirt was already becoming untucked. His curls, though freshly combed, were already starting to spring out of control. He bounced around like a hyperactive puppy. And Josie, she might as well have been a perpetual motion machine, her head spinning around to gaze at everything in wonder, her toes tapping, her fingers fidgety. She was fresh from turning cartwheels in mud, and she still had a trace of it on her hands. She grabbed the marker to fix Max's name without permission. Later that morning, she picked up the classroom bunny with such enthusiasm that she had to be reminded, gentle, gentle. During story time, she got so lost in the tale she yelled out, "No, Hansel and Gretel! Don't drop breadcrumbs! Use rocks or pine cones, something the birds won't eat!" So there in Max's kindergarten classroom, you had 13 perfect little whatnots, all seated around messy, imperfect, lovable, human Max. And then you had Josie, who, seriously, do I have to spell it out for you? Max's parents were paying to have Max surrounded only by whatnot children, only be perfect machines. But Max wasn't getting what his parents asked for because because Josie was like Max. Josie was human too.